Hello everyone, welcome to the problem solving session 12 for conservation geography. This is the last problem solving session that will cover the lecture that are discussed in this series or in this course. The next problem solving session, which is problem solving session 13, which is next week, that will be a summary of this course and overview of what all we have done in the past 12 weeks. But today is the last session which discusses the lectures that happened this week, right? Okay, so let's move on. So this week, because this is the last week of this course, the module that was covered in this week were special topics in geography and conservation. And I'm pretty sure if you have seen the notes or if you have looked into the videos, you will notice that the topics discussed this week were all very application based and how to actually use geographical information in real life scenario. And we looked at some terms that we are very well aware of, like remote sensing, GIS, and then how are they used for the maps that we use, the different type of models that we use. Then we also looked into disasters. How do we what is exactly about disaster that we are supposed to know, and how do we combat them? And lastly, we also looked at valuation of natural resources, where we are trying to put a value on the natural resources because that guides us and helps us in drawing conservation plans for these resources, right? So let's move on over these topics one by one. What I have done is because in the first two lectures, which is remote sensing and GIS and disasters, they had overlapping topics. So the first chapter looked at remote sensing, application of it, and then the second lecture started with a bit of remote sensing and lidar, if you remember, and then moved on to disasters. So I thought I'll club these two lectures together, and then at the end of the discussion we will have the questions for both these lectures, so that none of the topics seem very separated or disjoint. Okay, so let's begin. So remote sensing, just a second. Right. So remote sensing, as you know, is it's basically about like capturing images, trying to understand the meaning of the images, and the underlying principle that is being used here is photogrammetry. Now, what is photogrammetry, which is different from photography? Photogrammetry is basically the science and technology of obtaining spatial measurements. Spatial measurements mean basically what do they look like in space. Space is basically how are they occupied, and other geometrically reliable derived products from the photographs. So you're not just taking photographs, but you are inferring the photographs based on where they are present, how they are spaced out, what is their height, what is their width, how are this located, where are they located, what is the density, what all components are present. So all these kind of inference that you make from photographs, that's photogrammetry. Again, you can see in the image here that a photograph can be divided into multiple layers, and you can then interpret each of these regions separately. And like I said, photogrammetry is what is the basis of remote sensing. And as you would have seen in the lectures, remote sensing is basically any sort of just a second. Sorry. So remote sensing is basically any sensor that is being used to derive information, but from a remote location. So it's not really it's not really something which is taken from a close point of view, which is our normal photography. That is what we do generally, right? We just take normal photographs and then try to interpret that. But here in this case, what we are doing is we are getting information but from a remote location. And How does that help us? That helps us to know what we cannot perceive with our normal photographies, like capabilities, or normal cameras that we have at our hand. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about satellite, we're talking about drones. What are they used for? They're used for analysis. We'll see these things in a while. Sorry. You can do imaginary stuff. Then you can have software that actually codes for this and looks into all this information, and they give a very well defined careers, which are people people who study remote sensing and then get recruited for the GIS positions. And remote sensing is also used for weather forecasting, so they also have a career there. And of course, that also used for classification. So we will see all of these in a while. Now, as I have already mentioned, what is remote sensing? It's basically you have a sensor, and now if you imagine drone or satellite, they are far away from that object and they are sending some kind of energy. This energy, as we will see, could be active or passive. They send an energy, get a reflectance back. Just a second. Yeah. So they send energy. The energy is received by the object. The object sends back the energy. How? In what form? Reflection. That reflection is captured by the sensor. That's the only task the sensor has with perspective to the object. What happens after that is the information that is captured by the sensor is then translated into positions. We're going to do this in more details in a while, but you take away the position information from these like the reflections that have come back. Just a second, I'm not sure what's exactly happening. Okay. Sorry. Right. So you have reflectance from an object. You can imagine that they have reflected light back and a sensor has sensed it. The sensor has a tool that is going to interpret these all these information. In what form? The coordinates, where are they present, how are they present, and after that they will form an image like this rough image. And from this image, the person or the software or tool, it interprets different information from this photo image. What kind of information? What kind of landforms are present? What kind of coming back just quickly. So you have generated image from the reflectance data that the sensor has received back from the object, and on that image now we do several kind of analysis, and we will see there are so many applications that, or so many things that you can get out of this image. For example, you can get the height, you can get the type of land that is present, you can get this image for any particular unit. Could be a city, could be a country, could be a continent, any image, and you can finally look at what kind of land use is there, or where the land is present, where water is present, how much water is present, what is the depth of the water, what is the depth of the land. All this information that we have so far been reading in the past problem solving session is those graphs, those maps that we have seen and we have interpreted, have all been generated from such kind of data. Otherwise, how would you get the information about land use from a remote perspective? Okay, right. And what kind of platforms are used for this image? We are all talking about image here. So what are we using? Of course, camera. But the camera can be positioned at 3 different places. It's at ground level, where you're like literally placing the camera on the ground. The issue or the related problem with this is you need to take this camera wherever you want to capture the image, and that's a lot of manual work and that's a lot of effort. Next, you can have drones, but drones can only go to a certain limit, but you have to manually adjust again. And then you have satellite, which are exospace, so you know that they have more range that they can be covered. So you have satellite, drones, and ground cameras. And then you have these images. Now I am pretty sure if you would have clicked images, these terms are very, very common to you. You know what these terms mean. You know what's resolution. You know that resolution, when we say resolution of the image, we are saying clarity of the picture, how clearly you can point out 2 different objects in the image. Now that clarity can also be based and can also be tweaked based on several features. For example, the first one here looks at spatial resolution, and as you can see, it says it looks at the ground size of a pixel in the image. So if you have a 30 m pixel and you have a 1 m pixel, you can look at the difference of the images there. So this you can control to get the clarity of the image, how pixelated your image could be, and how clearly and how minutely you can capture the image. Next is temporal resolution, which is basically frequency of flyovers. So how much image or how many images are you getting over a period of time. So you can see here, let's say there's a set of images that you have taken, but those are over the year and very infrequently taken, or let's say over a longer period of time. But at the same time, in the second approach, even during one single day, you have so many images that gives you more images to lay over and get the information. In the other method, you have lesser images to lay over each other and get the information out. It's basically how are you taking the image. Just 1 second again, I'm so sorry. Correct. So the third one here is spectral resolution, or this what you can see here. This is basically talking about number of frequency bands. So what level of reflectance are you getting back? The more the colors, the more the resolution. Basically, if you want to have a multicolored image, you basically want more of these spectral bands so that you can discern those color. Otherwise, it can only be black and white color. It can only be 3 colored codes, or it can be have 9 colors. All these different to look at those finer details. All these, the more the finer details you want to capture, the more resolution you want to tweak for all these different categories. Last is radiometric resolution, which is basically the number of different intensities of radiation that the sensor is capable of distinguishing. So it's basically about the how much of the radiation can the sensor detect. Right. Now coming to this, which is again something that is related to photography, we are looking at, so this goes a bit technical about how do you capture image, when does the image which you are capturing becomes good. So that depends on several factors like focal length, angle of the light, focal length of the camera. F number is basically how focused the image is. Are you doing it at a far range or closer range? All these different parameters are basically what the idea here is that all these different parameters can be tweaked to get a better image. Now on the right, what I've tried to put is some basic concepts which are, if someone is like interested in photography, I'm pretty sure these are very common terms for them. But for me, I'm not really that well versed with photography, these few terms do make sense to me, and it's very obvious what does the meaning is. So for example, symmetry. I understand that if your image or if your photograph is symmetrical, it's easier for you to interpret those data. If you have a viewpoint, it means you have a perspective, where do you want to take the image from. That also makes sense. If you have depth of field, it's basically telling you what is the focus. So it happens sometimes, right, that you have your focus object is very far, so you want to focus your camera such that you only capture those image object clearly. So all these, and then shutter speed and aperture, these are related to light, how intense the light enters the camera, and the aperture, and how bright your image is. So all these are photography related concepts. Now moving ahead from this, those are all very technical, and I am sure that I have covered a bit about it, and it has been discussed extensively in the lectures. So you are more welcome, and I would suggest you to be mindful of what has been taught in the lecture. But what I will most focus is what are the applications of remote sensing? How are we using remote sensing in our daily life and for conservation? So as you can see, these are the different applications of aerial photography. So aerial photography is any photography that is taken from air, right, or above ground. So what do you see? The first image says large scale plans. Now if you have traveled from a flight, or if you know the vision from a flight, this is how your landscape looks like. What are those green parts there? The green parts tell you the ones that are covered in green. So forests or a vast patch of grass. And what are those orangish or gray color regions? These are the deforested part. And what are these little comb like structures or these little dots? These are housings. So just by looking at this image from a perspective, you can get idea about how that landscape is. Now I could be saying this landscape at a zoom level of a city, and I can tell you by looking at this how much of the city is urbanized, how much of the city is still retaining greenery. And that's the idea that we are trying to generate here. Now this whole image can also be for a just one particular housing society, and that also will cover the same kind of image where you have housing societies, the little parks that they will have, the little pools that they will create, the little housings for which are short in height, which are longer mansions. So all these information, and I am sure you would have seen such kind of images in somewhere or the other in your day-to-day life. So this is one of the application. The other application is such cadastral map. So cadastral map is basically breaking the entire region into several units or several parcels and looking at how these parcels are related to each other. This could be used for, let's say, a municipal corporation who have several smaller towns in their municipality or several villages, and how those villages are connected, how are their connectivity, how are they linked to each other. This kind of information all depends, but this is for a specific purpose where they are looking it from the perspective of administration, and that's why it's called cadastral. This is land use, and this term I'm pretty sure every one of us, at least in the past 12 weeks, we've been using so many times that we are very well versed with what is it. It's basically saying how the land use can be mapped. So you can see there are some blue portion, there are some very green region, then there are some red regions which are showing the regions which are, not really forested. So you can have these kind of finer details as well. The earlier one just showed me the deforested land and the green lands, but now I can go into more depth and see what kind of land use is there. Similarly, I can look at topography. What does topography say? It just doesn't tell you that it's green or not. It tells you what kind of trees, shrubs, herbs are there. So if you look into this, you will see trees and then you will see plains. So you can get this level of information as well. Where do you see trees? Where do you see plains? How are they distributed? What is the height of each? How elevated they are? So all these are topographical information. And if you're talking about topography, you also have water related information. What is the depth of the water, what kind of water, what is the vast expanse of water. All these kind of information can be derived from remote sensing data. Okay. And what do you do with all this type of information? You generate images like this. You generate models of digital elevation, which is basically you can have if you look into 3D models of how do I say, so you will see some housing societies showing the 3D models. So it's basically digital elevation models. So they have used the data that they have perceived. Now they have converted it to a 3D format, and they have now generated a housing which looks exactly how it is supposed to be, like the height, the breadth, the width, everything. And you can see that these show you the difference in height so well. This one is little, like it's deeper, it's at a height, these are all at similar height. So you can make a digital elevation model using the information from the remote sensing data. Then you have orthophotos, is basically taking the coordinates, putting it into an information. So you can see at this coordinate there were water, so it's a water body, but adjoining region, the adjoining land has trees. So you can get to that further level of information. And you can have a thematic GIS data. Let's say you want to only show the forest cover, you only want to show the forest or the land which is used for a particular type of crop. So all this information and this kind of maps we have seen in the past, that you can have a map, you can have a data which is only reflecting what is the level of, let's say, maize production, or what is the level of, let's say, timber production, and what is the level of usage of land for agriculture, for livestock. We have look at all this map, and they can all be retrieved from such data. So these are the information form that can be gathered from remote sensing. Now This was what was covered in the first lecture. So just so that you don't miss out when you are actually trying to revise. Up till now, what we have discussed was all part of the first chapter or first lecture this week. The second lecture started with something called LIDAR and then moved to disasters. Now, what I am going to focus is the first part of the second lecture, which is LIDAR. And before we understand LIDAR, we have to also understand what is active and passive remote sensing. What have we discussed so far about a sensor sending light and then receiving light back can be based on two different phenomena. One, it is not using its own energy. So, the light that it is capturing back, the it's only doing the job of capturing the light or capturing the reflectance. It is not doing the job of producing the light. The light that is being reflected is actually being generated by, let's say, sun. So here the first one here is a passive sensor, where, let's say, here for example, it is using sun's energy. So sun has light. The light is being reflected by all these objects. Whatever is being reflected back is being captured by the sensor. So sensor is only capturing and it's not emitting any light. But when you talk about an active sensor, you are talking about a source or sensor which is its own source of light. It produces the beam, it captures its beam back. What is the advantage in such scenario? The advantage is you can control the beam. You can control how focused the light will be on the object as compared to the other one where it is depending on external source. So the sunlight is very dispersed, right? It can be spread across the object, and more the light is spread on the object, there are also chances that there might be surface on the object that is not being like that's not receiving any light. But if you are doing active sensor, or if you have the active sensor there, you can focus the beam very strongly on the object such that the entire objects get captured. So in active sensor, that's the advantage. The problem associated is you need to make such a sensor that is producing its own light, and so you have to make all these facilities available on the sensor itself. And that's the idea for LIDAR. LIDAR, as the name suggests, light detection for the A's and ranging. So light detection and ranging, this is what is an example of active remote sensing. So as you can see here, LIDAR is an active remote sensing utilizing energy to generate the light or beams that interact with the object and bring the data back from the object. Simple to understand. You have a satellite. That satellite has its own source of light, which is the LIDAR system here. So it is pointing the laser beam. Here it is using laser instead of just a normal photon or normal beam, which is basically amplifying the beam and directing it to the object. So it's pointing it to the object. Now what has happened, it is perceived by the object and the reflected back, and the reflectors in that's captured by the sensor. So the light is also produced by the satellite on its own. That's LIDAR. And then what happens? What do you do after this? What happens after your own source of light is there? So once you have your own source of light, you also have attached several modules to it. Modules like IMU, modules like GPS, which is for the satellite itself. So now understand this, that the satellite has LIDAR. It is put light, it has got its light back. In addition to you understanding only the photograph, just a second. Right. So in addition to you understanding the photograph, looking at the photograph and saying, oh, okay, so if I put this images, stitch these images together, it looks like that this is more heighted, this is more depth. With that information, you also have information of the satellite itself. If you have that information, you will be able to calculate what was the distance of the light that was traveled, and what is the actual distance from the satellite to the object, which gives you a better resolution of where in the space is that object actually present. But what do you do? For that, you put IMU or GPS. So one of it calculates the altitude at where the satellite is present, what is the speed of the satellite. And GPS, as you know, it detects the coordinates and the location of the satellite. So you have the location of the satellite, you have the speed of the satellite, you have produced your own light, so you know the speed of the light as well. So you have all the information to calculate the distance of the object from the satellite. You have an image of the satellite from the satellite, so you have the image of the object. Image of the object gives you the physical information and where it is present. Distance gives you the actual location where exactly the object is present. So you see, it gives you a more pronounced information. So all this information, like I was saying, you take it to a laser scan, they detect it, and then they project it to a 3D for a digital elevation, or 2D is just the normal map or graph that we use. And then you put more information like positioning information, where is it present, the orthophotos information that we had been speaking about. Those information you put on these images, and then get a more informative data out of these images. So if you have to actually define the components of lidar, your laser is the first thing, that is basically the light or the beam of light that is being focused. Scanner and optics is basically what detects the light back. Photodetector, receptor, electronics, once you have detected the light, the sensor has detected the light, there will be a photodetector and receiver electronics that decodes this light that has been just received. And then you have the position and navigation system, which actually puts coordinates and looks at the image. So if the representative image on the right says the very same thing, and you can see here, right, this is the lidar system. So you have laser installed with GPS, IMU and a scanner. You have a reference light, you have the reflected light. This distance here can be calculated because of the presence of GPS and IMU, and that is the advantage of using an active source, and in this case laser lidar system. Right. Now, like I have been mentioning, lidar, which is basically using its own line, can be used for two kind of purposes. One is topography. So based on what kind of laser, you can extradate information. For example, if you use near infrared laser, which is, as you know, that these are dependent on the wavelength of the light. So if you use a near infrared laser, you can use it to map the land, and you can see how beautiful the image on the left is here. The blends which is showing you the land images. You can see not only which portion is green, which is more red, which has less of greenery, where the water is there, which is more depth water, where there is less of water which also has some kind of phytoplankton, zooplankton. So you can see what beautiful level of information you can get from a lidar system. This is topographic. The one on the right is a bathymetric, which is basically water penetrating green light, which is for seafloor and riverbed elevation. Do you remember the very first few lectures we have extensively discussed about seafloors? What kind of seafloor structure is present? What kind of, if you remember, guyots, canyons, all these different. How do you think that people in today's world, how did they imagine to get these images? You have such good systems now that you can get to such detailed information even from the sea floors and riverbed. So that's the application that lidar has for geography and by extension to conservation. And GIS, which is a regularly used term, right? It's basically geographic information system. We have just dealt with remote sensing. Remote sensing, as the name suggests, it just senses the data. What interprets the data is this whole suite of GIS. What do GIS do? GIS gives you map. GIS can help you in doing analysis. GIS can just simply give you the data. Just like interpret the data from the sensors. It is a software of its own. It can be linked to the satellites, have couriers and apps. This is what we have been told. We have already discussed. So if you want to describe or if you want to define GIS, it's basically a system which consists of a hardware of an equipment, which is basically sensing the whole thing, software which is decoding the light, and then a human person who's sitting at the front of the screen and interpreting the entire thing. So this is designed in a way such that you capture, store, manipulate is basically like converting the information to image form, analyze the data, and then manage it and present different kind of geographical data. So you can present the same data that has been derived from a single source in several different forms, as we have seen in the applications and the products. Right. So with that, we come to an end to this portion, which is talking about GIS and and sensing. When you go back to the lectures, you will see that it has been discussed very extensively and in a very technical manner. That you are, or where they're also showing you how do you calculate, what is the mathematical formula. I did not put this in today's problem solving session because I thought it would be too much for us to understand. But once you have the general idea of what does remote sensing and GIS and LIDAR actually do, those formula, those terms will not look very difficult to you, and I'm pretty sure it will be easier for you when you go back and understand that. So with this, we move to the next part of the second lecture, which is disaster, and we'll see uh, terms like flood, tsunami, what do they actually mean, and when you actually get to the stage of experiencing such disasters, what are the possible like what are the possible ways you can combat them. So disaster, disaster management, disaster, these are terms that are very frequently used. So let's today look at what do they actually mean. So disaster, as I will read out from the slide so that you actually get to understand this big passage, what does it say? So it's a catastrophe, it's a mishap, it's a calamity, or it's a grave occurrence in any area arising from natural or man made causes or by accident or negligence, which results in substantial loss of life or human suffering or damage to and destruction to property or damage to or degradation of environment, and is of such a nature or magnitude as to be beyond the coping capacity of the community of the affected area. So anything becomes a disaster when you have reached the tipping point. You We have rains every day, we have floods also every day, but that doesn't become a disaster in your nearby city. Or there could be an earthquake, which is quite frequent in the hilly regions, but that always doesn't become a disaster. You can have sandstorm in desert region, but that doesn't become a disaster. When do you call it a disaster? When it matches all these different categories that we have just told. First, it is anything that causes substantial damage to either environment or human, and it is of such a nature that it is beyond coping capacity. So a normal flood which happens after a daily or the entire day, if it is raining and you have a flood, you can still manage it because you can expect that the next day if there is no rain, it will dry up and the water will recede on its own. But if it keeps on happening, your capacity of coping is tested and it is reached beyond it, and that's when floods become a disaster. That's when it becomes problematic, when you cannot access food, when you have other problems related to flood. So what all these earthquake, as you can see on the left side, earthquake, flood, tsunami, volcanic eruption, sandstorm in desert, tornado, typhoons, all these are disasters when they happen at a very large scale, right? It's also covering not just these disasters that we know, we can also see that avalanche, mud flow, heat, storm, fire, all these can become disasters. Now, I used two terms while I was describing disaster, which was natural disaster and man-made disaster. So what are natural disasters? As very intuitively, these are caused by natural forces. But what are the type of disaster that fall under natural disaster? Everything that is not under the control of humans. Tsunami, flood, landslides, hurricanes, wildfires, which are because of, say, lightning, volcanic eruptions. Of course, we have read this. We have studied volcanic eruptions so much detail that I'm sure that if you think that if you try to remember, you will recall that it's not at all under control. And then droughts. Droughts basically when you don't have water at all. These are not under control, and you can take steps to minimize the effect, but not to avoid it. Floods will come if there is a region which is prone to flood. Maybe this year it is not raining, but sometimes in the next year or next to next year, you will have that rain again, and that's not under your control. But you can take steps to control the effect of it, and we'll see how. But now, man made disasters, these are fully avoidable. And we'll see what does man-made disaster involves. Man-made disaster involves hazardous material spills, explosions, chemicals, biological attacks, things that are under human control. You people are, like using ships for transporting so many hazardous material. What if this gets spilled over? There is oil spills in the ocean, in the sea, which is so problematic for the aquatic animals. Not only them, if it happens to enter the sewage, or it happens to enter the land, then it also comes to our houses. So that's something that is controllable because that's under human influence. So you can carefully plan and you can prevent these. For the natural, you cannot prevent them, but you can control them. That's the basic difference that one should first of all be clear about. Now, there are some terms which are very important when you talk about disaster and disaster management. When does a thing become disaster? When it is not a disaster, and at that stage, what do you perceive them as? So the first word is hazard. Hazard, as you see, is a process or a phenomena or any human activity that may cause loss of life or injury or other health impact, or it can also damage your property, that can be leading to disruption or degradation. So it is a potential event, or it's a potential process that can do. So things that can lead to such kind of problems is a hazard. Now, hazardous event is basically the manifestation of the hazard in a particular place during a particular time. So, let's say there was some process that you knew will lead to environmental degradation. You knew that was a hazard, and because of some reason there was no care taken for it. So now it has actually manifested, and it is actually now showing the effects that it can. That's hazardous event. It has become an event, not a disaster yet, but hazardous event for sure. Exposure, the situation of people or any infrastructure, housing, production capacity, and other tangible human assets located in hazard prone areas. So whoever is experiencing the problems of hazard, that particular section is called exposed section, or the exposure limit. Vulnerability, these are the conditions which are determined by physical, social, economical, all these different factors, which increase the susceptibility of an individual or a community to the impact of hazard. So hazard is all this is there. You are trying to basically understand what is the vulnerability of a particular sect or particular process or community for that hazard, and then why is this important? This is all important for planning your mitigation steps. Next, you have disaster, which we have already discussed. Then you have critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure are basically the physical structure, the facilities, which provide services that are essential to the social and economic function. Why is this important? Because if you recognize the critical infrastructure, you can focus your direction of prevent when you are trying to reduce the effect of your disaster. You can focus on these infrastructure that get the most damage and that are also responsible for sustaining the community. So if you are able to manage or protect this infrastructure, you have done you have done a major part of your planning. And then you have disaster risk. So it is potential loss of life, injury, or damage asset which could occur. So it's the same as hazard, this vulnerability, but this is now if the thing accelerates to a disaster, who all are at a risk. And you can see this is a function of hazard, exposure, who's more exposed. If they're more exposed, they have more risk. If they're more vulnerable, they are at more risk. If their capacity to recover is less, then they're at more risk. So these are the risk assessment for disaster. And then you have the whole management, where you're organizing, planning, and applying measures. First of all, to prepare if, let's say, flood happens. First thing, to prepare, get yourself food stacked up in the house. You can cordon off you can build, like parapets to control or prevent water incoming. Let's say that doesn't help and water does manage to come inside or manage to fill your entire locality. How do you recover from it? How do you respond? How do you recover? All this should be well planned in advance so that you can manage disaster. And similarly, you have contingency planning, which is a management process that analyzes disaster risk. So all this disaster risk that we have just done, that's not just something that you will look into and keep it with yourself. When you have the data, you act upon it by putting it thoughts for the responses and recovery. Next, you have early warning system. So it's basically an integrated system of hazard monitoring, forecasting, prediction. You would have seen, right? There are so many weather forecast tools which says there's going to be flood, there's going to be sandstorm, there's going to be this. Why is it important? Because that enables humans to take precaution before the event actually takes place. So that's also part of your disaster management, and that's very important. Capacity is basically, as I mentioned, is the combination of all the strength attributes and resources which you can use to reduce the disaster risk. If you are well capacity for reducing risk, then so basically who will be called as having a greater capacity? The one who has the amenable resources. The ones who don't are the ones who require attention. And then, of course, build back better. How do you come back from a flood? After the flood water has receded, how do you come back to your normal life? That also has to be thought well before in advance, so that once the disaster is over, how do you come back to normal life? So all these are very important. And where does whatever we have read so far, GIS and all this comes into play? It comes into play in forecasting and letting people know about the problems that they're going to face. So, like what I have been saying so far, disaster management basically is a cycle of its own. It's basically looking at disaster, it's looking at how to respond, how to recover, how to prepare, and how to mitigate. Mitigate is basically how to not have the adverse effects of. So it basically starts from this blue circle, blue point. You are preparing yourself for the disaster. Let's say you have made changes such that you don't get to have the disaster's harsh effects. But let's say you have the disaster after that. How do you respond and how do you recover? So this is what your preparations is basically pre-impact. Mitigation is basically capacity building. Capacity, as you know, is how good you respond. And like when you do disaster risk assessment, you get to realize who are at the problem, who has less capacity, and you start building their capacity. You better their capacity, and that comes under mitigation. And then you have the event, and the immediate response that you give for a disaster, that's a response that comes under emergency. And then you have restoration and reconstruction, that is part of recovery, which is after your disaster has or receded or has gone away. How do you come back to your normal life? How do you, so let's say there has been disruption to any infrastructure. How do you come back? How do you make that back? How do you make it better? Of course, you make it stronger so that it doesn't happen the next time. So those kind of thought process. So as you can see, the four main things that is part of disaster management are preparing, responding, recovering, and preventing. This is mitigating it. And so let's look into what are the different types of things that are tasks which is under all of these phases. So mitigation, you can imagine mitigation is where you will be doing public education and awareness. So you're basically going into your city and making people aware that this is what you should do and this is what you should not do, this is how you should take care of. You do all this assessment, hazard and vulnerability assessment, and get to identify those community which require help, and then you improve the infrastructure. This is all mitigation, how to mitigate the issue. How do you prepare? You have national emergency telecommunication and response plans. You know that this is going to be flood, so we should be ready with this. You have trainings and exercises for all the community people who are supposed to respond the correct way when the disaster happens. Early warning, which predicts well before in hand, and SOPs. Say there's a earthquake in this region. It's an earthquake prone zone, and you have an SOP. Whenever you have earthquake, you should move out of your houses. You should go assemble in a bigger, broader, wide area. All these are SOPs, and all these have to be told to people well advance in time. Okay. Now, but what happens when your actual disaster take place? The first is response, where you are communicating and coordinating to save life, and then you have recovery, where you are doing the same things that you were doing in preparation and mitigation phase, but now in a better way. For example, you are restoring telecommunications infrastructure, you're improving lives, and you are mostly focusing on the rehabilitation of other services. All the services, remember, you have communication, you have transport, everything gets disrupted in disasters, and the society or the community needs to be very well equipped so that they can recover from this at a very quick pace so that they come back to normal life in real time, right? Right. So with that, we come to an end of the first and the second lecture. It was a big lecture, big discussion. And what I have done or have tried to do is I have put 20 questions, as always, that I do, which cover this entire lecture. And they are covering what I have discussed so far, and there are also some part which is not discussed, but it will be helpful for you when you revise. So I will read out the questions. Wait for 30 seconds because there are a lot of questions today, and give you time so that you read the questions and you see if you can answer it while the session is on. If not, if you're doing it when you are revising, you can of course pause and then answer this for yourself and then come back and check. These questions, as always, have questions from previous year's assignments, previous year's exams, and some new questions. Okay. Okay, so the first one is bathymetric lidar, which we have discussed, which is for remember looking at the sea floor. What kind of light does that use, right? IMU, which is part of the lidar system. What does that stand for? What is it actually trying to calculate or measure? What is the full form of it? Third is, I have seen the answer. I'll just read out the question and then I'll get back to your answer. Third is, dash is the ratio of focal length divided by diameter of the entrance pupil. That is the diameter of the aperture. Which of these talk about this particular method or this particular definition? Next, which of these is not an application of aerial photography? We have done aerial photography's application, and which one do you think is not a part of it? And lastly, this is the definition which is talking about serious disruption of functioning and all these different capacity, which is his definition for. So while people are reading this, I am going to just look into the answer here that has been given. Just okay. Let me give you the answers. Right. So the first one, bathymetric, is green light. The other one, which is topographic, which was far infrared. It's okay. It's just for your own vision. IMU is inertial measurement unit. Focal length, when you divide it by the entrance pupil or when you divide it by the aperture diameter, it is the F number. Okay. Which of these is not an application of aerial photography? All of these are. So none of these is the wrong thing. And disaster, as you had correctly guessed, this is about the disruption of normal functioning. Quickly moving on to the next five. Now lidar has four components. We have looked into this. They have laser, and then they have something, and then they have photodetector and positioning system. So what is the third one? No, second one, sorry. Now next is, which of these is a management process that analyzes the disaster risk and establishes arrangements in advance to enable timely, effective, and appropriate responses? Next, assistance and intervention taken directly before, during, and after an emergency, which is basically quickly responding to the disaster. What is that? Next is, dash refers to the frequency of flyovers, that is how frequently we are getting data about the object. This is about resolution. Out of the four type of resolution that we had looked into, which of this is the answer for this? And then you have retrofitting to enhance suitability of the infrastructure. It's basically, what are you trying to do here? So what is the method here? Give me 10 seconds and I'll get back to you with the answer. Right. Let me look into the answer. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I'll let you know the answers. Right. So the first one is, as you have seen, lidar is basically laser that gives the light, scanner that detects the light or receives the light back, detector that interprets the light, and then positioning and navigation system gives you the data. Contingency planning is basically management process that analyzes, because it's about analyzing the disaster. Early warning system is basically when you are predicting and forecasting the disaster, the impending disaster. Assisted in intervention taken directly, so anything which is in emergency phase, it is response. Number of flyovers is temporal by time. You're looking at what time, how many times you are getting the information. Temporal is basically time. Retrofitting to enhance suitability of infrastructure is mitigation, because you are taking active measure to combat the disaster risk. Right. The next five, as you can see, these are very simple questions and they don't require that much of you know difficulty. Okay, these are potential loss of life or injury or damages which could occur to a system or society. Yes, I will do. I will do. Yeah, I will go back to the slide. Okay, I'll go back to the mitigation slides and I can explain to you once again. Mitigation. So preparing and mitigation is basically which is before the event of disaster. Preparedness is basically, you are trying to set up protocols of what you should do. Just a second. Yeah. So preparedness is basically you. So you can imagine, right? You are preparing yourself for an exam. So you are studying and you are taking all the measures to know everything well before in hand. You have a timetable. So you still look at the timetable. So you're preparing yourself for the coming disaster, be it flood, be it anything. You are preparing yourself. Okay, this is going to be flood. So I should know when the flood is coming. My community should know what should you do when there is a flood. My people should know how to receive the information. There has to be communication system. This is all preparedness. But what do you do for those events is what is mitigation. So let's say in your region, you know that there is less parapet walls or there is less infrastructure which are not really very strong. Prepare yourself to combat it. But how will you combat it if your infrastructure is not good? So you actively put effort into doing the betterment. You improve the infrastructure, you go and talk to people, you create an SOP in preparedness, but you talk to people and give those SOPs. That is mitigation. You are actively taking measures to reduce the impact. Similarly, you are doing all this hazard and vulnerability assessment. Only then you can think about improving the infrastructure. Everything which is actively your involvement in improving your condition is basically mitigation. I hope that's clear. If not, please let me know. I'll explain it better. So here also, right, you can see mitigation is basically building a capacity. Preparation is basically preparing yourself that okay, I am well prepared. If the flood comes, I will go out of the house and this and that. But if I go out of the house, where do I go and how do I go and why should I go in the first place if I can build a better place? So all these building better thing, telling people, those are capacity building and that comes under mitigation. Is it clear? You could type in your doubts if you have any. Okay. Okay. Uh, so coming from, so I will just go over this last question because that's where mitigation came, right? So you see, retrofitting to enhance suitability of the infrastructure is basically you are building the infrastructure, you are improving the quality of your infrastructure so that you can withstand the disaster better. So you are actively putting effort into reducing the risk of disaster. That's mitigation. Okay, right. So let's look into the next five questions. So the first one, as I discussed, if there's a potential loss of community or life or to life in a community, and which is determined based on exposure, hazard, vulnerability, and capacity, what is it actually telling you about? Now, there were towards the end of the lecture, there was the discussion on Prime Minister's 10-point agenda for discussion reduction, disaster risk reduction. So, which of this is not part of that? Do you think? Next is the camera is placed horizontal in which of these platform for image acquisition. So, think which one is going to use it that way. Plans and procedure designed to save lives and property when an emergency occurs. Which of this refers to that? And topographic lidar. Now you tell me which one is the correct light which is used to look at the land. Right. Let me give you the answers. And yeah. So the first one is disaster risk that we had discussed. Second, or next question here, global risk mapping, women's leadership, and social media is all part of the disaster risk reduction. Social media, because as you know, social media is one of the quickest way in these days to pass on information. So you do require social media, which is available to everyone, and it's a good way, it's a good method to pass on information. For example, early warning system can be used. You can have social media where you can display the forecast. uh, so your camera is placed horizontal for ground board. For airborne and spaceborne, you can have them at different angles, and you can also have them at different positions. So it's basically how do you put the camera, and of course, if it's a ground base, you have to put them at horizontal. Vertically is not possible. Okay. When you make plans and procedure, which is for this saving life, you are making plans, that's preparing yourself. You are taking action for, let's say you have planned that okay, you should have a better better infrastructure, and you are actively building better structure, that's mitigation. And lastly, topographic is near infrared that we have already seen in the previous slide. The last 5 questions for this unit. Which of these are products from aerial photography? Next, the conditions determined by physical, social, economical factors which increase the susceptibility of a community to hazards. Next, which of these does not belong to capacity building action for disaster management? So, when you broadly look into disaster management cycle, you have a capacity building method, and then you have the response and recovery method. So which one of this is not part of capacity building, and the other thing, other half? Next, the combination of all the strength, attribute, resources which is available within a community, which helps it to manage and reduce disaster risk, refers to what? And lastly, what is the DGPS, or remember we spoke about this in respect to LIDAR, what does it actually tell you about? Okay, me the answers to you. Right. So the first one is about aerial photography products, and we have discussed all three. So all of them are the products. The conditions which increase your susceptibility is your vulnerability. Next, which of these is not part of capacity building? Prevention, mitigation, preparedness, all are part of building capacities. How do you tackle the disaster? Response is recovery, and how do you react to the disaster? Combination of all the strength and resources, basically capacity. We have discussed this, and last is DGPS is basically GPS, differential GPS. It gives you the position. So what I want to let you know from these is um, all these different terminologies that we have discussed. Please be very mindful of what those terminology actually refer to. Those are the kind of questions that actually come in the exams, and you need to be very particular about what they will be seemingly very similar to each other, but there are nuances and minute differences that you should be aware of. So when you are studying and when you are preparing for exam, please be very particular about these few differences. Okay, it's not difficult, it's just these technical things which are very important to remember. Okay. Okay, that brings me to an the towards the second half and the last portion of today's discussion, which is valuation of natural resource, and this is not a very difficult concept to understand at all. Here also, there are some minute technical things that you should remember, very minute details that you should remember, differences that you should remember, and that will help you understand the entire lecture very easily. Here, as the name suggests, we are putting value to our biodiversity or natural resources. Now, natural resources can be renewable, non-renewable. These are, we have already looked into stocks and reserves and potential reserve. All this we have looked into, right? Now, what we are doing is we are putting values to all these different activities or functions or products that we can get out of it, so that we have something where we can monetize or we can give economic perspective to this resource. Why is it important? We'll look into it in another few slides. So, what kind of values do biodiversity have? You have money, economic, you have scientific, that is for research purpose, you have cultural. People associated with nature in many cultural ways. You have recreation, you have ecotourism these days, you have a region which is like people go for recreation, and you have ecological life support. All these, remember, nitrogen fixation and watershed fair benefits, these are all ecological support, right? Similarly, you can see for biodiversity conservation, you have look into the benefits. The benefits of biodiversity is part of biodiversity conservation. If you highlight the benefit, it gets easier for us to imagine why conservation of biodiversity is important. Now, coming to it, why do you put valuation at all? What's the importance? First is this aids in cost benefit analysis when the natural resources are diverted. Natural resources being diverted is basically being used up. So you are doing deforestation, you are converting a piece of land which was forested into something which is more amenable to mining. Good. What do you do before doing this is basically you do cost benefit analysis. This forest was giving me fruits, this forest was giving me wood, this forest was giving me timber, and then each of this is sold in market. So all of them have some prices. How much price does that total thing end up to? Now, if I remove this forest and I do mining, how much money do I get out of mining process? First, I have to invest some money to first set up the mining plant, and then I will get the money from the product of these mining activities. Now, you compare the money that you get at hand and you have spent with the money that the forest was already giving you in its natural form, and you see if it's a cost and what is the cost and the benefit scenario for you to do this. So you can, this is used in that way. The other, it gives an evidence to aid habitat conservation policies by highlighting the economy. This is what we've already discussed. If you know that a region is important for nitrogen fixation, for watershed activities, you can, you know, pitch in more with more confidence that these areas need to be conserved. Next, you evaluate the economic compensation legally required for damage to natural resource through polluter. It's very easy to understand. If you give values to biodiversity, let's say water, and you give a particular value to it, and then there is a disaster which is man-made, and there is compensation to give, it's the value that you have put in the biodiversity. For example, water here, water body, that is the amount of money that the company or the resource person has to pay for the disaster. It basically puts in a checkpoint that okay, you are doing this at your own risk because this has this much money to give back. So then people become more mindful of the activities that they do. So all this is important for conservation and for understanding the importance of biodiversity. So now, coming to biodiversity's importance, there are goods that are products that we buy and sell, right? So there is a monetary function but it's a monetary value in the function, right? You have timber, you have fish, you have mushroom, or food. We'll see all these different kind of category. But it's not just money. It's also important because of the ecosystem function that we have been discussing so far: water filtration, climate regulation. So these services are also evaluated, maybe not in monetary terms, but we will see how. So, when you have values for biodiversity, there are categories of these values. You have use values, you have non-use values. These two come under so these two are broad classification. In use values, basically using, you either use it directly or indirectly. So let me give you a better idea. So when you are using the biodiversity, when you are using the product, it's use values. When you are, there is nothing using, there is no using per se of the biodiversity, that's non-use value. Now when you're using the products, or when you're using the biodiversity, you could be directly using the fruits, the timber, the wood, that's direct usage. But then you have also some indirect usage which are not related to extracting anything from the nature. Will it gets more clearer when I move to these slides which are pertaining to all these different uses. So direct uses are commodities, are products that you are using: food, medicine, biological control, industrial materialism, and even ecotourism, because in ecotourism as well, you are basically using the patch of the land or biodiversity for your purpose, and that is monetized. So if you want to use, you give this much of amount of money. If you want to use, you are creating and you're investing so much that it becomes a amenable part for ecotourism. So you're investing money, so it's monetization. That's why it comes under direct use. So food, I am sure I don't have to explain you that right from anything that we eat comes from biodiversity, be it animal, be it plant, be it any other source, which where the food raw material comes from the biodiversity, nature around us. Medicine, it's not just the product, it's the entire plant as a whole. You have roots, stems, barks, leaves, fruits, seeds, everything can be used for several medicinal purposes. And medicine, when I'm talking about, I'm not just restricting myself to plants, I am also talking about animals. For example, cone snails, cone snails, they have venom. Venom is, of course, look is in a very negative sense, but the same venom can be repurposed and used for treatment of many diseases or many problems. For example, cone snail venom can be used to make drugs like ziconotide. Similarly, you have snake venom. I'm pretty sure everyone knows that snake bite and snake venom very problematic issues, because they affect the in some snakes, they affect the nervous system, they affect the how the neurons act with each other by disrupting the signaling. But this same venom can be repurposed and used as the acetylcholinesterase inhibiting drugs. So basically they can be used for cases like stroke or heart attack. So, for example, you have Bothrops atrox that has been used, the venom has been used for actually producing drugs which are used in medical setup, by, for example, captopril or enalapril, for with specific medical use. So, you see, biodiversity, be it plant or be it animal, is so important and has so much applicability. So, coming back, biological control. So I'm sure you would have heard about BT brinjal and BT cotton. What's the BT there? The BT is actually coming from Bacillus thuringiensis, and these bacteria, from there you have taken gene which is now repurposed to make pest resistant cotton and brinjal. So you are using natural resources for coming up with something very genuine and very useful product. So that's again coming from nature. Next, you have, of course, industrial materials, be it rubber, jute, cotton, dye, resin. All of these have so much applicability in the industries, and the raw materials, of course, come from the nature. And this is what I was talking about, ecotourism. You can see how peaceful this image. Just by looking at this image, you can understand why it is so important. It's of great aesthetic value. And in this slide, I actually told you how much these this ecotourism contribute to the global revenues. It's $12 billion. You can imagine how much important it is, right? Okay, so not only that, this is so here we have an in ecotourism. It also has a habitat, so it's providing habitat, it's allowing us to stay, it's allowing the animals to stay. So it is also giving this habitat which is being used, again as I said, used. So it comes under the use value of the biodiversity. So now, after that, you have indirect value. Direct use was all of them. But it's indirect. Indirect is, of course, you are using, but not in this manner where you are extracting the information. So what are you still doing? You are looking into the ecosystem service. So all this, having a tree, what does it do? It prevents soil erosion, flooding, soil fertility, nutrient cycling, nitrogen fixation, all these different methods. Now see one of them, prevent flooding. Now in case of mitigation of flood as a disaster, if you focus on planting more trees or plants, you are using those biodiversity for your own resources. So that is also equally valuable, and that puts money to it. Social value, this comes from the cultural beliefs. So there are values which relate to people's social life, customs, religion. So people value the biodiversity because they are important for them culturally. So you have a social value which is like, which is associated with the biodiversity. And not just social, you also have ethical, where you believe that in some communities they believe that every species has an inherent ethical or existential value, and you tend to preserve these more, and that value is what enables you to conserve these biodiversity. And then you have an option value. Option value is basically you are keeping the options open for future use. So you are using it right now, but you also can choose not to use it and keep it for future generation. It's up to you, it's your option. So you have this option value as well for biodiversity, and it makes it very important because it includes the knowledge embodied in organism, in as much as the loss of species represents the loss of information. So you don't want to lose out species because you know that they will be useful in the future. So you know that there is industrial application, agricultural, pharmaceutical. So you don't want to exhaust the resources, you want to use it for future, and you invest in keeping those resources for future generation. So that's option value. Now these were all usage. In future also you are using. In indirect, even if you are social or cultural, you are using them. You are using them because you are associated with them. But there are some values which are not use value. Why? Because there is something called existence value. Just because it is existing, it's similar to this that we have discussed here, ethical value, where you know it is existing and it has a value, so you should not cause any harm to it. There could be altruistic value. These values are basically you we are not using, say there is something, for example, there is something in another part of the world which is being used by that community. We know of it, but we are not using it. But just because it is being used by someone else, we value it so much. So that's altruism, right? And bequest value is similar to option value, but bequest value is basically saying it's a moral value, saying that everyone, every generation should have enough to use, and we should compensate our children in the future for the loss of wealth. So option value is where you are optionally doing this. Bequest value morally influences you to keep something for the future generation. So all these are different kind of values that you give to biodiversity. So just to conclude it once again and quickly, you have forest values, which are use value, no use value, and option value. Use can be direct use or indirect. Direct use can be because of taking out products from the forest, or non-extractive, where you have tourism and recreation. Indirectly, you have these ecosystem services, and we have done a problem solving session dedicated to how these water filtration and these water shedding benefits can amount to money. So refer to those problem solving session. Next week, I will be giving you the summary of this entire course, where all these topics that we have touched on, all the 12 problem solving session will all be covered and interconnected, giving you a flow of how to read when you are reading and a quick brush up of all that we have discussed so far. So there we will come across once again on all these different things that we have studied. Okay, and we have been speaking about putting value, how do we actually put value to it? So there are three ways that you can put values. One is market prices. So there is something which is already being sold in the market. So they have a pricing. Based on that, you put your own value. So something which is sold in the market has, of course, its own pricing method. So market pricing. Hedonic pricing is basically, you know, it's being sold in the market and you know it's being used by the people. So when you're putting the value, you put the maximum value because you know that it is being used, so you can put the maximum value to it. Travel cost is basically trying to understand if it's being used in the market, how much does it cost, not only just the product but the entire process of taking it there, doing this process, doing the extraction, everything else. So travel cost comes under market price because it's all under marketing. Next is circumstantial evidence, which is our imputed willingness to pay. Now you are clearing a forest and you want to see the how much you have to pay, what was the money that was associated. You could do this by replacement cost, which is also something that we have discussed. If there is a water body and it is doing wetland, for example, it is helping in your purification of water which is there. Now if you don't want to do this, and what is the alternative of water purification? Is the water purifier. So what does this cost and what is that cost? Which one is easier and which one is cheaper for me and which one has more value? That's replacement. And when you are doing deforestation, if you're causing damage to the environment, what is the damage cost that you are incurring? Because that is also part of your money that you have to pay. So this is also a way of evaluating. Lastly, you have contingent valuation, where you want to compensate but you don't know where to start. So you ask people, hey, do you use this plant for your usage? Yes. What do you think if I remove this? How much should I compensate you? That's another way where you don't have a place to begin with. You simply go for options and opinions from others. So that's why it's expressed willingness. So when people are expressing their money or willingness to pay, that's contingent valuation method, or that's why survey. When revealed willingness is when you know that this is the money that has to be paid, that's market. Imputed is what could be the payment that I have to make. You're imputing it based on some other information, which is, let's say, replacement or damage cost. That's the amount that you have to pay when you are uh, imagining a different circumstance. So that's why it's circumstantial evidence. 1 minute. Right. Yes. And with that, this session comes to an end with these 10 questions. 5 questions here, and the next slide has 5 questions. And that summarizes this lecture. I will read out these questions and we'll do this exercise that we have just done quickly, and which will bring us to an end of this session. So first one, which of these is an odd one out? So you have 4 values here and you know the classification of values. So which one do you think doesn't fit in? Altruistic, bequest, existence, and option value. Next, the value derived from knowledge of resources used by others in the current generation. Which value is that? Which of this is incorrect with respect to indirect value? So when I say indirect value, which one of these doesn't fall in that? Which of these is not a consumptive? Consumptive is basically when you are using the resources directly as products. And lastly, which of these uses revealed willingness to pay? So which one is revealed willingness to pay and which one method actually falls under that? You try to. Yes, I've received the responses. I will give you the answers. Okay, great. Okay, the first one is altruistic, bequest, existence. These are all non-use values. These are altruism, bequesting, existence. It's more about exactly non-use values. It's more about what do you believe it, what's your moral saying, and why are you valuing it? Because you're not using it, but it's because of your morality and your ethics. So option value, on the other hand, talks about usage. You say that I have the option of keeping it for the future generation, and the future generation will use it. Okay, next one, value which is derived from others usage in the current generation. So you are, as a person, not using it, but you know that someone else is using it, and because someone else is using it, you value the biodiversity, you value the resource, and you also uplift, you also understand the importance. That's altruism. This is a very normal ecological concept, and that's also altruistic value here. Now, which of these is incorrect with indirect values? So, ecosystem service, evolutionary process, watershed benefit, these are accessory functions which are related to biodiversity. So, there is not directly being giving money, but ecotourism gives you revenue. Ecotourism, if you have a land dedicated for ecotourism, you get money out of it directly. So, that's direct use. Which of these is not a consumptive? Consumptive is products. So timber or firewood or anything which is non-timber but products, so resins or anything else, fruits. All these are products which are being used for getting money. Education, yes, it's used, but it's not consuming the forest. Very nicely, it has been explained by the in the lecture that in use value or in consumptive value, if you are using, the other person cannot use it anymore, or it reduces. So for example, timber, if there is a certain set of timber products, I use the timber, if I use half of it, the other person is left with only half of it, so there is a reduction in number, right? Similarly with firewood, which is basically again wood, which is also again with products. But education, you are getting money out of it, but if I am studying a plant, that doesn't stop the other person from studying the plant. The plant is still there, you can study other aspect, I can study other aspect, or we both can study the same aspect. So it's not consuming. Consuming, as of course, by logic, if you're consuming something, it is reduced, so it is not reducing in any manner, that's why it's not consumptive. Okay, and which of these uses revealed willingness to pay? Revealed willingness is you, but when you know the market value, and that comes under market price. When it is imputed, it's the damage cost and the replacement cost. It's when you are expressing how much you want to pay, that is contingent valuation. With that, we come to the end of 10th slide with these 5 questions. So which is the value deriving from the knowledge that the resources continue to exist? Okay, imputed willingness to pay uses replacement cost method, and which other method? Next, which of these uses expressed willingness? When you are expressing the willingness to pay, which of this method falls under that? Option value refers to an option for the future indirect and direct use, but of what? And the value of leaving use and non-use values for offspring of future generation is called what? I have received one answer. Maybe I'll wait for a few more seconds if you want to attempt the other. Okay. Okay. Cool. So let me give you the answer and the explanation. Okay, great. I think I've received quite a lot of answers. Okay, let me give you the answers and you can check if you were correct. Correct. So the first one is dash value deriving from the knowledge that it exists. As the name suggests, there is something that is existing and you are valuing just because it is existing. That's existence value. Imputed willingness to pay, when you are checking what will I have to pay by imputation, by substituting something else. So when you're substituting, you are doing either replacement or you are looking at a damage cost, right? Which of this method is express willing? When I don't know what to pay, so I look at what people are willing to pay and I make them express this by asking them question. That's contingent evaluation method. Okay. Ninth, as you had mentioned that, sorry, option value is basically biodiversity in general. Doesn't matter which resource we are talking about. Anything which is kept as an option for future for usage is option value. Any resources which comes under biodiversity. And lastly, the same thing, leaving this usage and non-usage values for future generation is also bequest value. When I say option value, I have an option of leaving or using. Bequest value is more of a moral value where I know that future generations should also be using it, so I have to keep it. When I put a compulsion on myself, that's bequest. When I keep it as an option, that's option. So those are the two minute differences that you should know between these values. So in this aspect, you need to be clear about the type of values that you have: indirect, direct, use, non-use. You need to be very clear where are these, how are these structured, okay, and then the different type of values, of course, and how are you evaluating the money, how do you put money, which methods are you using for understanding. Last slide, last. Sorry, do you have a question? Is it not clear? Last slide, last question, and eighth question. Yes. So bequest value and contingent valuation, right? I'm in understanding that. How do I do this? Okay, I'll go back to the slide and then I'll explain. So this is your bequest value, and let me see the eighth question. Contingent valuation. Okay, I'll start with the valuation first. Okay, this is your slide which is talking about how do you put money to your biodiversity, right? The first one, yes. The first one is market price. So the money that you are putting, that is already there in the market, so you know where you are beginning with. Let's say I want to clear a forest patch, and forest is giving me fruit, the forest is giving me wood, the forest is giving me timber, and all of these are sold in the market. And so I look at the market prices for this. Now some of these commodities, for example timber, they are sold extensively in the market, so I know the market price value, right? So I can do that. What, that's the first method, market price method. If it is sold in 1 kg so much amount, I will also weigh my how much wood can be present here, and I will give that much amount of money. The other is, let's say 1 kg is being sold for roughly 200 rupees, okay, that's very weird, but just to understand. So 1 kg is being sold for 200 rupees. But when I do the second method, hedonic pricing, what I do is, why 200? Everyone should be, like the maximizing the benefit of it. Let's put it to be 300, or let's put it to be 400, or let's put it to be 100. Something that is benefiting most of her. So it doesn't actually follow the market price method, but you have taken your inspiration from how much the money is in the market. Travel cost method is not just the product in the market itself. You are also looking, if I have to take it to there, if I am coming from one place to here, if I am investing other things, how much money do I get? But the important point here is, I know where the money should be or which range should be, because I have a place or I have a reference point which is market price to refer to. That's market pricing. Now let's say this place, this forest, had something which I don't know how much to value. For example, there is a plant which is to be removed, but how do I give money to the plant when it is not giving me wood, when it is not giving me anything else? But I know that it is helping in nitrogen fixation, or I know that it is helping in some kind of plant is obviously helping in nitrogen fixation, air purifying. Okay, I know it's a good plant which can do good amount of air purification. Now I don't have a market value for a plant which is used in air purification, right? So how do I give money? I start by circumstantial evidence. I impute money. What do? I say that okay, this is the money that can be used for purification. How? I look at air purification, which is already there in the market, which is of course used by other material. I have a way to start there. Okay, this costs me this much. But if I have to make that material, I have to put more investment, more money goes into this. While this plant is doing the same activity, so I should put this amount on this plant. It's not a direct plant money from the market, but it's imputing by what you're doing here. You are replacing it with another substance and then checking if what is the value of it here, right? Or if I remove this plant from the forest at all, what is the damage that I would be creating? If let's say my plant, because of the removal of my plant, the air quality becomes weak, so I have to put an air purifier. I have to put other resources that checks the air temperature, that checks everything's humidity. So I have more money to invest here. So is that beneficial for me? That's damage cost. So here, the second scenario, you don't know where to start, but what you can do is you can change something, you can substitute, or you can do damage cost, and you can understand what could be the money of these resources. In the third one, you don't have a replacement, you don't have damage cost, you don't have a market price. So what do? You ask the people who are there, who are part of that forest where you are clearing out. You ask them, "Hi, this plant I want to remove. If do you consider this plant to be important?" The person will say yes. So then I will ask, if I am removing this plant, how much money do you think I should give you as a compensation? That person will give you a quote of something, some price. That is the price that you start with. So that is survey. You survey and you get the money. So these are all values, methods of evaluation of putting values onto the resources by using direct prices from market, by using circumstances, or by using surveys. I hope this part was clear. Cool. And the other question you asked was 10th bequest value. Yes, I will come to bequest value. Bequest value comes under non-use value. Bequest value is, I'll read out first for you. Bequest value says each generation should bequeath is give or donate, something like that. Bequeath enough and as good for others for future generation. We should compensate our children in the future for the loss of them. So bequest is also keeping your resources for the future generation, but here you are not using it and you are keeping it for future generation. An option value, you are using it, but now you want to keep it for future generation so that they can use. So bequest doesn't make their bequest doesn't say that they have to use it. Bequest is upon your as a generation. I, as my moral duty, should keep them for next generation. So that's the bequest value. But when I put an option to it, that's option value. So bequest and option are both the same thing. One is from the perspective of you deliberately choosing that, okay, I will not use it, I'll put it as an option. That's the thought behind that. In the other, which is bequest, it's your moral duty to save it for the next generation. So you have to save it. That's a compulsion that you have to keep it for the next generation. So that's compulsion one place, and there's in the other you have a choice. I hope that makes sense. Let me go back to the question, and if it's not clear, let me know. Yeah. Was it clear? Bequest and option. They both talk about giving the values to the next generation for future use. One talks from the perspective of I should do it. One talks from the perspective of, I can do it, so think I will go for it. That's option value. You have your optional. You have an option to do that, and you are choosing the other options. Okay. Yes. Well, that brings us to an end of this session. And next session, this is all that this course had to offer to you and what all you could grasp from it. Next session is entirely revision, and it will be covering all the 12 lectures and trying to give you a mind map of how should you go about in this course. I have not yet thought how to go about it, so I put more questions or just mind map, but yes, it will be more of revision. Do we get to solve questions? Yes, of course. So my sessions have a lot of problem solving questions. So like I put a lot of questions. That's only because that gives you a grasp of the entire lecture. So of course, questions will be part of my summaries session as well. I'm just thinking how to put it. Should I put it chapter wise or module wise? That's what I will be coming up. But there will definitely be questions, as has my previous sessions been. So yeah, questions will definitely be there. So you can definitely come and check. And if you have any doubt, please let me know, or else we will meet at each other in the next session, which would be the last session for this course.